We invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
Wednesday evening Bible study, and we are continuing with church history beyond the Trail of Blood, a short history of Baptists in America. Now, the lessons I've been bringing may not seem to be too short, but actually, if you see if it was a printed book, it would be about this big, 500 and something pages. Anyway, it's electronic, so I don't have to look around. So this is part number 4. And in this part, we are going to consider other churches that were Baptist in New England and just where they were located. So we're going to start with the state of Massachusetts. Today, the state of Massachusetts is one of the most liberal states that we have in our country. So let's look at Baptist churches in Massachusetts. If, with most writers, we leave out of consideration the Baptist meetings held by Obadiah Holmes, we recognize that term from our previous studies, and his fellow believers at Rehoboth in 1649. Then the First Baptist Church within the territory, now covered by Massachusetts, was also the First Baptist Church of Wales. The leader of the band of Welsh Baptists, who in 1663 took refuge from persecutions, took refuge in New England from persecutions under Charles H. 1662 and onward, was John Miles. Now, I'm not sure who Charles H. was. That's the way that it appeared in this history. But it's probably, I would guess, if I was guessing, it would be Charles II. Because sometimes the scanning doesn't bring it out very well. So that they should have made their way to the Plymouth colony was natural in view of the well-known tolerant disposition of its authorities. Rehoboth, where they settled, had already, as we have seen, witnessed the holding of Baptist meetings. They did not have, at this time, they did not have a meeting facility, but they were meeting in homes and not HOLMS. Like many of the ministers who sought in New England a refuge from the persecutions of the British authorities, Miles had behind him a long career of distinguished youthfulness. When Obadiah Holmes was gathering the Baptist converts of Rehoboth for worship, Miles and an associate, Thomas Proud by name, were planting a Baptist banner at Ilston, Glamorganshire, Wales. Of the early life of Miles, we have only meager information. Born at Newton in Herefordshire, about 1621, we find him a student in the University of Oxford 1636. He sprang from a region whose soil had been enriched by the blood of martyrs in medieval and later times. It had been the stronghold of Lollardism in the 14th century, and it gloried in being the birthplace or the scene of the labors of such evangelical heroes and martyrs as Bradford Dine, Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, and Walter Brute in the medieval time, and of John Penry in the age of Elizabeth. Now, we haven't heard about these people, and Newman doesn't give us any details about it. The destitution of gospel privileges in Wales about 1641 was truly appalling. Evangelical preachers had been hunted out by the Laudian Inquisition, and the great majority of the ministers of the established church were ignorant and corrupt. According to Vavasor Powell, the great Baptist evangelist of Wales, a petition was sent to the king in Parliament about 1641, setting forth humbly and truly by many responsible persons that after minutely searching, scarcely were there found as many conscientious, settled preachers in Wales as there were counties in it. In other words, there was less than one preacher per county. Miles began his ministry about 1645. Under what circumstances or with what views of truth we're not informed. According to the records of the Baptist Church at Liston, which Miles and his brethren brought with them to New England, the organization took place April the 1st in 1649. The heading of the first page is said to run, quote, names of the brethren and sisters who were added to this church from the first day of the second month in 1649 to the 16th day of the same month in 1650. The name of John Miles heads the list and is followed by that of Thomas Proud. It is probable that Miles and Proud had been baptized shortly before their inauguration, of their work at Ilston and into the fellowship of a London Baptist church, now meeting in the Glass House, Broad Street. I would think that would be Dr. Newman that would be saying that in parentheses. So apparently when he was writing this in 1894, it was still in existence. Whether they had apparently gone for this purpose. The London church, it is related, regarding the coming of these brethren and their proposal to enter into evangelistic work in Wales, was a direct answer to their recent prayers for the evangelization of that region. A letter written by the pastor of the London church, dated Barnstaple, May 9, 1650, is of interest in this connection. Quote, Dear Brother Miles, having heard lately by some of your fellow countrymen and also some of the brethren in London of your seeking the way of the Lord and the participation of the ordinances of the gospel in accordance with the proper mode of the gospel, we could not less than bless the Father in your behalf, that you have fully submitted to the way of truth. Give my fervent love to all the church. Unquote. The London church long continued to regard the evangelistic work of Miles and Proud as their own, and were always ready to give the advice that the Welsh evangelists did not fail to ask of their more experienced brethren. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a minute. In reading this, it seems that they, in our vernacular, it seems that they were seeking sponsorship. That's what we would call it. From this London church, for them to go to Wales and be missionaries there in Wales and to establish churches. That's what I read from this exchange. That terminology is not used, but the relationship is certainly there. It is probable that the evangelists received material assistance from the same source. In the Ilston Church book already referred to appears, quote, a brief report of some of the chief providences of our Father towards us, his poor and despised people, who have by great grace been baptized into the name of Jesus Christ and to the profession of the gospel, and have united in fellowship with one another in this church. Unquote. The following record will be of interest. Quote, we cannot do less than admire the unsearchable wisdom, power, and love of God in bringing about his own purposes, which transcend the power and understanding of the wisest of men. Thus, to the glory of his great name he dealt, for when there was no company or society or prophets setting forth and preaching the doctrines of worship and order of gospel discipline according to primitive institution, that we ever heard of since the time of the apostasy, it pleased God to choose this dark corner to put his name in, and to give us poor, unworthy creatures the honor of being the first in all these parts to observe the glorious ordinance of baptism and gather together the first church of baptized believers. That was a mouthful. All one sentence. That the zealous laborers had much to discourage them in the early stages of the movement, and that they yet had a strong and abiding faith, is evident from the following extract from the records already quoted. It pleased the Lord to give us some signs of his purpose, to gather to himself a people to walk in fellowship with them, his servants, but in order that he might be seen more visible in his work, he began with 2 women who were baptized about the beginning of the 8th month, and then, for instance, it says October. I guess they calculated months different. 1649, and thus teaching us not to despise the day of small things, nor to judge the work of God according to appearance or human probability.
You think maybe it was the 8th month when they started?
Not sure. not sure why it says 8th month, and then in parentheses it says October. Because the two don't sit together, but I don't know. But I didn't change it because that's part of the record. For when these feeble creatures were baptized, there was not a strong probability that one more would be added to us. Yet the Lord went on and called 4 more women before one man offered himself. Now, isn't this typical? Typical in our day and time. And now we see it wasn't any different back then either. But the community was ripe for such gospel efforts. And during the year following 46, were baptized into the fellowship of the little band of believers. In 11 years, the increase of members had increased to 263. The labors of Miles and his associates extended over a considerable territory, and meetings must be held in several localities in order to accommodate the people. The entire church, however, were expected to meet together in Illston on the first day of every 3 weeks for the breaking of bread. And I would take that to mean observing the Lord's Supper. A number of other preachers were soon raised up in connection with the laborers of Miles and Proud. And by 1651, there were 4 churches in fellowship. The name of Miles appears as one of the testers or triers in connection with a parliamentary act for a better propagation of the gospel in Wales, signed February the 22nd, 1649. The aim of the act was the rooting out of the corrupt and worthless ministers who abounded, and the supplying of the principalities with worthy ministers. In other words, kick out the frauds and put somebody real in position. In a few years, the religious aspect of Wales had completely changed owing to the successful working of this measure, which from a Baptist point of view was by no means an ideal arrangement, but which, on the assumption that the church endowments and rates were to be maintained and administered under the direction of the state, was a practical necessity. Miles was far from being alone among Baptist ministers in consenting to act in such capacity. Toombs, Jesse, and Dyke were among Cromwell's triers for England, and the first 2 at least ministered to beneficed churches. It should be observed that Miles and Proud were by no means the first Baptist in Wales. Vavasour Powell and Craddock had been for some years evangelizing in Wales, but as they were open communionists, and I'll pause there to give you time to write that word out, communionists. Sorry? Right, that's not communism. That's communion with ISTS added on it. It means they observed open communion. But as they were open communionists, the results of their work had appeared in mixed rather than in Baptist churches. Baptist principles flourished in Wales, And Welsh Baptists have long been noted for their consistency and devotion. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 drove Miles from his pastorate. Excuse me. He is numbered among the 2,000 ejected ministers, and as he had acted under the Cromwellian government in capacity of trier for Wales, so he seems to have received support from the parish revenues that had earlier been enjoyed by the corrupt minister of the parish. We would not be understood to justify his acquiescence in this state church arrangement, but it is desirable that we should understand the real relations of things in order that we may appreciate the situation of Miles and a number of other excellent Baptists of that time. In other words, we were not there in their shoes, so that they probably were doing the best as they could under a difficult situation. The case seems to have been something like this. The Cromwellian government had not confiscated the church endowments or abolished the old methods of raising church revenues. The great majority of the residents in the parish where he labored desired his services in the ministry. His ministry was acceptable to the state church authorities, and as things were, the members of the parish must contribute through the legal channels. And the income from endowments, if there were any, must pass through the hands of government authorities. Miles and his Baptist parishioners might have said, and perhaps ought to have said, no, we will have absolutely nothing to do with a state church arrangement. We will pay our church rates if we must. We will let the government make what use it pleases of these and of income of the parish endowments. We will not submit to having the qualifications of our pastor passed upon by the triers appointed by the government. Much less shall our pastor countenance the continuance of the state church by sitting on the board of triers. Board of triers, that's your... Besides paying under protest what the state may exact, we will, as pastor and people, pursue the New Testament plan of direct dependence on the church on the one hand and voluntary support of the gospel ministry on the other. This would have been heroic, but the supreme importance of this voluntary system and the deadly evils of all state churchism seem not to have impressed men like Miles, Holmes, Dyke, and Jesse, as they impressed many Baptists in the 17th century, and as they have impressed nearly all Baptists from that time onward. With a company of his Welsh brethren, Miles made his way to Rehoboth, as has already been stated, and was not slow in instituting Baptist worship and ordinances in his new home. Now let's look at the persecution in Massachusetts. It does not appear that any coercive measures were undertaken against the new organization until July 1667, when Miles and Brown were arraigned before the court for their breach of order in setting up of a public meeting without the knowledge and approbation of the court, to the disturbance of the peace of the place, and fined each of them 5 pounds, and Mr. Tanner the sum of 1 pound. And we judge that their continuance agreeable, being very prejudicial to the peace of that church and of that town, may not be allowed, and do therefore order all persons concerned therein wholly to desist from the said meeting in that place or township within this month. I'll pause here. You note I did not make any reference to that footnote or that note that you have in your notes. That just simply describes the triest that what it did and this type of thing. Yet, in case they shall remove their meeting unto some other place where they may not prejudice any other church, and shall give us any reasonable satisfaction respecting their principles, we do not know that they may be permitted by this government so to do. It is evident that the Baptist work was being pushed with some vigor, and had become a matter of alarm to the pastor of the Church of the Standing Order. Excuse me. It is further evident that the authorities had ceased to regard anti-fetal baptism with the horror of the earlier time, as compared with the attitude of the Massachusetts Bay authorities before and after. The last sentence of this pronouncement is toleration itself. Yes, ma'am. Huh? Which they hadn't been in a long time. Massachusetts would have imprisoned and banished Miles and his associates. Plymouth simply requires them to remove to a convenient distance from the Church of the Standing Order, so as not to disturb the peace of the church and town. In other words, if you're going to meet, you've got to be far enough away from this other church to make him nervous about it.
Most convenient for the enemy.
That's right. Absolutely. In October of the same year, the court set apart for them a large body of land near the Rhode Island frontier, which they named Swansea, in commemoration of Swansea near Ilston, their Welsh home. The land grant was made in the names of Captain Willett and Mr. Payne, who were Pedo Baptists, and 3 of the Baptist brethren. Captain Willett proposed to the other members of this new township. Whoa. 1, that no erroneous person be admitted into the township either as an inhabitant or sojourner. 2, that no man of an evil behavior or a contentious person, etc., be admitted. 3, that none may be admitted that may become a charge to the place.
No welfare there. Right.
It is somewhat humiliating to Baptists to find the church under Miles consenting to these proposals with certain explications. As it is the aim of this history to relate the facts precisely as they occurred, it may be worthwhile to quote the terms in which they accepted the proposal to exclude all erroneous persons. In other words, they're giving definition to the law. Quote, that the first proposal relating to the non-admission of erroneous persons may be only understood under the following explications. 1. As of such as hold damnable heresies, inconsistent with the faith of the gospel, as to deny the Trinity, or any person therein, the deity or sinless humanity of Christ, or the union of both natures in him, or his full satisfaction to the divine justice of all his elect by his active or passive obedience, or his resurrection, ascension into heaven, intercession, or his second coming personally to judgment, or else to deny the truth or divine authority of the Scriptures, or the resurrection of the dead, or to maintain any merit of works, consubstantiation, transubstantiation, giving divine adoration to any creature, or any other anti-Christian doctrine directly opposing the priestly, prophetical, or kingly offices of Christ, or any part thereof. 2. Or such as hold such opinions as are inconsistent with the well-being of the place, as to deny the magistrate's power to punish evildoers, as well as to encourage those that do well, or to deny the first day of the week to be observed by divine instruction as the Lord's Day or Christian Sabbath, or to deny the giving of honor to whom honor is due, or to oppose those civil respects that are usually performed according to the laudable customs of our nation, each to other, as bowing the knee or body, etc. Or else to deny the office, use, or authority of the ministry of a comfortable maintenance to be due to them from such as partake of their teachings, or to speak reproachfully of any of the churches of Christ in the country, or of any such other churches as are of the same common faith with us or them. You realize that was in one sentence? I challenge you to diagram that.
No. So it's interesting with these particular rules and stuff. If they were enforced, churches get smaller now.
Yes? Absolutely.
That's a fact. They would be smaller now.
Well, we desire that it also be understood and declared that this is not understood of any holding any opinion different from others in any disputable point, yet in controversy among the godly learned, the belief thereof not to be essentially necessary to salvation, such as pedobaptism, anti-pedobaptism, church discipline, or the like, but that the minister or ministers of the said town may take their liberty to baptize infants or grown persons as the Lord shall persuade their consciences, and so also the inhabitants take their liberty to bring their children to baptism or to forbear. In other words, what they're saying is you can do what you want to according to your own beliefs. Well, that's liberty, is it not? Here we see the result of Miles' training in connection with the state church system of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate. He had failed to grasp the great principle of absolute liberty of conscience, which the mass of anti-pedo Baptists from the Reformation time onward had consistently advocated and practiced. So in other words, as sound as he may be in others, in this he wasn't very sound. If this document means anything, it means that Miles and his Baptist brethren would have cooperated with the pedo-Baptist inhabitants of the town of Swansea in excluding by forcible means, if necessary, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans, Armenians, Socinians of all classes, Sabbatarians, and Quakers. Roger Williams would have been almost as unacceptable in Swansea as he had been 30 years before to Massachusetts Bay authorities. And few, if any, of the Baptists we have encountered in New England would have been able to endure the test. But Miles had become quite old and feeble, but he remained a pastor until he died. Now these are my thoughts. We often think that calling a pastor is a problem for modern day churches. But it was the same problem in the 16 and 1700s. The church went for a significant period before they were to get a new pastor. Some of them were good and the church flourished, while others were not so good to stand for Baptist views. Newman continues with a lengthy account of the First Baptist Church in Boston. The church was started with individuals that came from sister churches in South Carolina. And that's the way it was spelled in the book. Okay? And from Baptist churches in England. The First Baptist Church of Boston became, as might have been expected, the mother of churches. Yes. Gotcha. It was South Carolina and still until statehood. All right, the Newberry Church was formed in 1682 with the assent and no doubt with the cooperation of the Boston Church. It is probable that several of his constituent members had been connected with the older church, and Newman makes a reference to where he got this from his source. The church was organized by William Scriven. You recognize that? We've seen that name already before. Humphrey Churchwood and others at Kittery, Maine. Kittery still exists. During the same year was likewise due to Boston influence. Yes. Yes. You are correct. I was preaching a revival in New Hampshire at that time, and the pastor took us over to Kittery. And we had never been to Maine, and had always heard the phrase, the rocky coast of Maine. And so this pastor took time out while we were there preaching a revival at his church. He pastored, and took us to the rocky coast of Maine. And we read some of the history of Kittery, Maine. Sorry? 24 degrees wasn't that bad?
No. Cold. It's Maine.
You failed to understand where we had been at that time. No. Sorry? No. We lived in upstate New York. And yeah, it was. When you're on the ocean and it's that cold, that wind coming off the ocean,
And the wetness of the air.
and the wetness in the air, yes. Yes. There were boulders on that beach that were as big as houses. And this pastor told us, he said, you see those big boulders out there? He said they are literally washed up from the ocean. Okay. Rocky coast of Maine. All right. The important and interesting history of this movement we shall have occasion to narrate elsewhere. By 1694, there were 2 Indian Baptist churches in Massachusetts. One on Martha's Vineyard and another on Nantucket Island. Thomas Mayhew, the proprietor of Martha's Vineyard, had treated the natives so humanely that large numbers of them had accepted the gospel. Next slide. His son ministered to them in spiritual things. The first to introduce Baptist views among them appears to have been Peter Folger, who was employed as a teacher among them during the absence in England of the younger Mayhew. So friendly were these Indians that during the terrible wars of 1676 onward, they remained faithful to the English. Now, let me pause here. Was that the French and Indian War? No? That's later? All right. Folger became a member of the First Newport Church about 1675. Now, get this. One of his grandsons was Benjamin Franklin. Yes, sir.
Some of the leaders in the American Revolution, military leaders in the American Revolution, fought the French and Indian with the British against the French.
Okay.
So that gives you kind of a time frame. It was right before 2 years.
Yeah. All right. Here you see the connection of the Rhode Island church in Newport with the one in the church in Massachusetts. I thought it was significant that Benjamin Franklin was a nephew of his pastor. The first Indian Baptist pastor of whom we are informed was John Tecumseh. Though not himself a Baptist, Mayhew expressed the highest confidence in his Christian character. Quote, I had frequent conversation with him while he was in health, and sometimes in the time of that long sickness, business whereon he died, and never from the first to last. So anything by him that made me any ways suspect the integrity of his heart, but did ever think him to be a godly and discreet man. Unquote.
Brother Joe, it's astounding. He was a pastor of a Baptist church, but he wasn't a Baptist.
Yeah.
His death occurred in 1708. A sixth principal Baptist church was formed at Swansea in 1693 under the leadership of Thomas Barnes. In 1732, a Baptist church was formed in Rehoboth under the ministry of the learned and zealous John Comer, who had given up the pastorate of the first church, Newport, on account of his acceptance of the doctrine of the laying on of hands. Now, 4 words there. But, unlike most six principal Baptists, continued to be an earnest Calvinist. 30 members withdrew from the first church, Swansea, without ill will on either side, so far as it appears, to form the new church. The elders and messengers of the Swansea church assisted in the installation of the pastor. A revival ensued immediately upon the organization, and in less than 2 years the church had a membership of 95. Comer labored with consuming zeal. His evangelistic efforts, yes.
This
Yes.
makes no sense. If he is a Calvinist, how is he evangelistic? And how is there revival if he's Calvinistic?
Good question.
You can't be either of those things.
I can give you kind of an answer.
Uh-oh.
Because with Calvinists, there is, like I said, here's Calvinism, but there's all these different branches of Calvinism. And some of this idea is the ones who God has set aside to receive the gospel, then they are to preach the gospel. That should follow. I know it sounds really strange. So it's kind of a oxymoron, you know.
That's what it is. It doesn't make sense.
Their reasoning is we don't know who God has chosen, so we have to preach the gospel to everyone.
Yeah, Brother Joe, with that being said, the pastor that was at Skyline before I got there, he became a diehard Calvinist, and he said this, and I've got a copy of his white paper. He said that he believed that God had chosen a certain individual, and he was just hoping that his children were chosen by God to accept Christ. I know.
All right. Back up, we didn't finish that one yet,
Yeah.
fella. Comer labored with consuming zeal, his evangelistic efforts extending far beyond the limits of his own community. He died of consumption in his 30th year, May 23, 1734. In other words, he died of,
Tuberculosis.
yes, tuberculosis. Though his life was cut short, the life work of few of his contemporaries was more fruitful than him, a Calvinist. Largely through the influence of the labors of Comer in 1632, a Baptist church was organized at Sutton, September 1635, of which 2 years later Benjamin Marsh and Thomas Green became joint pastors. The church divided by mutual agreement in September 1783. Huh? 38. Sorry, yes. September 1738. Green becoming the pastor of the new Leicester Church. In November 1736, a Baptist church was organized at Brimfield. And 5 years later, Ebenezer Moulton, whose ancestor, Robert Moulton, had been a member of the first House of Representatives at Boston in 1638, but who was among those disarmed in 1637 in connection with the antinomian controversy. And then Newman cites where he got his information. Yes. Yes, from the Moulton family.
Joseph, these names come out. One of them was Hertfordshire, England. That's where my great grandmother was from. I knew she was from England, but that was that area there. I don't know anything about it, but I think her family was Congregationalist or something.
Which would be consistent with that area.
Exactly. I don't know much. I wish I talked to her earlier, where she became an immigrant. I think she came over on the ship and went through the
All right, conclusion to part 4. Thusly, we come to an end of the narrative concerning the Baptist churches in Massachusetts. In the next session, we will begin to consider the Baptist in Pennsylvania and the Jerseys. Any questions? Carmen, comments?
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.